The return in the Indian markets over the next 20 years is going to be lower than the return in the Indian markets in the past 20 years.
If markets were to disappoint in the next decade or so, what would be the reason?
Because people have put in so much money at such absurd prices that has resulted in creating a bubble. When you go to a party, great party, let's say, will start at 8 to 9 p.m. There's a great bar going, cocktails are flowing. If you enter the party at 8, you'll have good fun. 11 also, you'll have fun. But if you enter the party at 1:30, you will only see people vomiting around you. Same thing is applicable in the stock market also.
Generally, people get drawn by this euphoria only. So most people would enter at the euphoric level before, and that's the reason why people lose money.
Disappointing results only come from high prices. From the bottom, you are always happy. Enjoy the benefits of compounding from as early as possible, because you actually have the time that can allow compounding to create magic. Aim for financial independence, but don't link retirement to that. Biggest asset that you have is yourself. How much money you would make in your 40-year career, that amount would be far larger than any investment that you hold today.
Warren Buffett is sitting on a lot of cash and he's been selling.
He has a $380 billion cash pile. You see, he has to trade elephants. If you buy an elephant, it's impossible to sell an elephant. So he has to buy from the perspective of holding, because when he sells, there will be no buyer. So, and that problem retail investor does not have. You can get in and get out of a 100 crore position very quickly. Institutional grade people who are going to a war with AK-47, and a retail investor is essentially going with a knife. When everybody think मैंने कल पैसा डाला मेरा डबल हो गया, तो वो ग्रीड को आप समझो और आप उससे बचो.
The global financial system is carrying more debt today than any point in recorded history. Governments are borrowing more than ever, not just for new growth, but to service the existing debt. Central banks are trapped between inflation and growth. At the same time, India is being called the world's fastest growing economy, trading at very high valuation premium. Passive investing is exploding. AI is reshaping capital allocation, and an entire generation is being told that the financial freedom is just a portfolio away. The big question is not whether markets will grow or not, but whether investors truly understand the risks they are taking. To explore that, I am joined with Jimit Modi, founder of Samco Group, one of India's most followed voices on the market structure, investing behavior, and long-term risk. Jimit, thank you so much. Welcome to Beyond Titles.
Thank you so much, Suresh,
Thank you
for having me.
So, Jimit, first question. We have Zerodha, we have Grow, we have Upstocks. A lot of them are funded. They just changed, I would say, the entire brokerage industry, coming with zero brokerage. It's a zero-sum game. So where does Samco fit into that?
If you look at a lot of our competition, what they've done really is they've tried to build great platforms that can give access to the stock exchanges. So essentially, they're playing the role of a facilitator, where you have the client on one side, you have the exchanges on one side, and you just are building a bridge to be able to. In the process, you're charging a low or a negligible fee for that. And in our view, that actually democratizes access, but access need not necessarily change the outcome. Just because brokerage has become free, it doesn't mean that more people have become successful in trading and investing, right? So our goal, I think we are very clear that so today, when we run a brokerage outfit which sits within our wealth umbrella, we are clear our job is to influence the outcomes. Can we try and get investors and traders have better outcomes? So the way we are positioned is that we are ones who are offering systematic scientific research embedded onto a flat fee discount broking platform. So you have the access layer, but you also have a layer of advisory and research, because the truth is that 90% people will need some form of handholding, assistance, advice. And that's not because of any other reason. It's just because the market itself is so large. There are over 5,000 listed companies on both BSE and NSE combined. I mean, it is humanly impossible
go through
to go through everybody.
Yeah.
So to help people actually get a better understanding of what are the options, what are the opportunities, what's happening in the market. On any given day, there is lakhs of crores of turnover that's happening. So for a human, it's impossible. So I firmly believe that it's great if a human gets assisted by a system or is some form of advice, and I think that's where the role we want to play ourselves. That we want to offer scientific research and go to the crux that the reason why people lose money is because they do satta. So we said, boss, ab sattebaji band karo. And if you stop speculation and you try and bring in some science into your trading and investing, the odds of you succeeding will go up much higher.
But have people learned from that? Because, we read that more than 90+% people, maybe because they trade in options as well or futures as well, lose money because the greed is still there, right? To make money. But have you seen a trend where people, do you follow how people invest their money? And since you're providing this research, or is it just that you just can't avoid that human greed?
So I think one encouraging thing that we have seen is that we have seen people on our platform at least who lose a little bit less. I wouldn't say they don't lose, but that's not possible. But if I would say that if for the industry that number is about 93%, we would probably be in the sub 70s when people lose money. And I think the reason why people lose money in options, right? I think it's very simple. Options actually is the highest leverage product that exists. Whether you're buying or you're selling, the quantum of leverage is high. Options, whether you like it or not, is also the most mathematically complex. So if you ask 99% people who trade options, that explain to me how the Black-Scholes formula works, which actually goes into making finding the price of an option, I'm sure most people will not know.
Yeah.
So leverage and complex math is a deadly combination. And because of that, most people end up losing money. Those who do make money, they actually continuously keep making money consistently for years and years. So I think those who figure out how to manage the leverage correctly, as well as understand the complexity behind the math, they are super successful. And the hope is clear for us. As a brand, that try and get as many more people to trade more scientifically, to trade with more better understanding of the leverage that they take, and hopefully try and improve the odds. See, like in any other business, people make a big deal about 90-10 in options trading, or for that matter in any. I'm saying probably go to MCA, and this is something that nobody has asked or done. Check the number of companies that are actually truly successful. My guess is that will also be 90-10.
Yeah, correct.
Only 10% of companies are actually truly successful, but 90% companies are actually in the dumps, or they get struck off, or are eventually liquidated. So the fact that 10% people are successful and 90% most people fail at things is true. That's even true for that matter, YouTubers. The odds are much worse. So in fact, I read somewhere that only 2% YouTubers actually become truly successful and 98% don't. So in my view, if you contextualize that correctly, 90-10 is still not that bad a number. So can it get 80-20? Can it become 70-30? The hope is yes. But idea is that just people get more aware and improve your odds at getting successful in the markets.
But you were saying take less leverage, stay away from high risk products, be patient. It's very opposite than what your business drives, right? You will, as a business, and I'm tracking, you will make more money if people will trade more, right? So for an audience, whom should they trust? They should trust Jimit, who says be patient, be careful with leverage, or they should chase Jimit, the business person, which business would demand take more leverage, take more risk?
So actually the business also needs you to take less leverage. The business today, there are two parts of our business. One is a segment which I call the 90-90-90 segment, which is 90% people are going to lose 90% of their capital, in 90 days of beginning and starting their trading account.
बड़ा तेज है. I mean, that fast.
That's fast, okay? The other math is the people who survive the 3-year mark, which is the 1080-day mark, they essentially become investors and traders and stock market participants for life. So, if you survive till year 3, you will then essentially be a customer of the firm for 10, 15, 20 years. Now, from a business perspective also, I am more happy to have a customer who stays with me for 10, 15, 20 years, because the value of that relationship is much larger than a customer who may overtrade, may have excessive leverage, may give me very high revenue in the first 90 days and then taper off to zero. So standard business sense is also very common, that you effectively, you don't want a client who just comes to you once, right?
Absolutely.
The foundation of every business is repeat business. And for us also, we want a customer to survive, to make sure that he doesn't blow up his account, to get to that 3-year mark, because once you get to the 3-year mark, you will be a permanent market player and you will keep making money over and over and over and over again for many years. So to that extent, the goal of the business and the advice are aligned.
So you just spoke about YouTube, and I have a question that, in today's time, and this is mainly for people who are watching this, is a lot of people, us, get influenced by people giving advice on YouTube, right? What's your view on that? Because a lot of people do follow that. What's your view of what the term called Fin influencers or whatever it is, right? What's your view on the whole Fin influencers fraternity?
I mean, it would be unfair to generalize and say that everybody is good or everybody is bad. I don't think there is one general statement that can probably justify what's happening or explain what's happening. My view is, from a viewer's perspective, right? I think you have to get inspired, but don't try and imitate. So, or don't try and look at it as a medium of how you can learn the art, how you can learn the science, but don't try and look for shortcut answers of just buy this or buy that, etc., etc. So anybody who's selling certainty, who's selling guaranteed return, who's selling a specific stock is a big red flag. So you should avoid definitely that. But there is also so much great advice, so much great knowledge on how you should actually invest, trade, what are certain frameworks, what are certain principles that you should use. And they are actually, when applied correctly, can be useful for any investor or trader. So I think get inspired, don't try and imitate, and don't try and look for a particular influencer's advice as the holy grail, because there is no such thing that
Holy grail is not there.
That exists. And I think eventually, for every viewer, even people who might listen to this podcast, the most valuable thing in the market is independent thinking, which, I mean, if I have to explain in simple Hindi, सुनने का सबका, करने का खुद का. So you listen to everybody, hear everybody's perspective, take as much input as you can, but build your independent mind so that you can take independent decisions. Because what happens is that no influencer is going to be there with you throughout the whole ride. They will, so let's say somebody may, or for that matter, even in the traditional world, you would go to a party and ask a friend over a drink, कि भाई क्या लूँ, and he may say ये buy this or buy that. Let's say even Rakesh Junjunwala ji would have come and told you भाई ये ले ले. But he's not going to call you कि भाव 5% ऊपर हुआ अभी क्या करूँ, 5% नीचे गया अभी क्या करूँ, अभी he may have sold or may not have sold. So you're never there throughout the ride. So unless and until you have your own independent thinking, you will only last for a while if you are trading or investing of borrowed conviction.
So just to zoom out a bit from an economic level, and you have said this, and I started my introduction on that. And not just me, I think so. This is a topic which has been going in the economic world on the debt crisis which the world is facing. And you yourself has said the US debt is like a ticking time bomb, right? More than $1 trillion of just interest payments. And I was actually seeing that the US defense budget is only 900 billion. So, the just the interest payment is so high. So first, to understand from you why this debt is becoming so much or out of control, and how does a US debt crisis affects someone sitting in India? How do they get affected with that?
So, see, the fact is, like you rightly pointed out, US is now paying $1 trillion in interest. Interest has become the largest expense item of the US budget, larger than defense, almost as equal to Medicaid that they usually provide for. And they're sitting on about a $38 trillion, or I think $40 trillion debt quantum. The problem is when the largest economy in the world is borrowing and is also borrowing just for its interest payments, the flow of capital substantially goes into then servicing the interest and not into genuine capital expenditure, building other assets. India, for the longest time, and all other emerging markets, were a beneficiary of a period when the US had actually low debt. When the US had, in 2000, 2001, before the 9/11 crisis, I think the US debt had fallen to sub 50% levels as well. Oh. And at that point of time, the interest burden was not so high. So there was a lot of money that got invested in emerging markets. And India was one of the beneficiaries where a lot of money flew into India, bought assets into India. It's very simple, right? I mean, if you think about a country as an individual, अगर आपका majority income interest भरने में जा रहा है तो तुम asset क्या ही खरीदोगे? तो तुम्हारे पास asset खरीदने का पैसे नहीं बचेंगे. So that is an implication. So essentially a share, the share of money that can come into India becomes a problem. Secondly, if the largest economy in the world is borrowing so much, which is AAA in the truest sense, the cost of borrowing for anybody who stands in line behind them goes up. So as a country, we are always going to be second-rung borrowers, third-rung borrowers as compared to a fully developed economy like the US. So cost of capital for a country like India, and therefore people like you and me and businesses, etc., will always be high. And why that? It all goes back because once you have more debt, you end up printing more money. You end up causing more inflation. You end up having higher interest rate. Higher interest rate in the world's largest economy essentially means that you have higher interest rates pretty much in the world. And the biggest problem is a sustained period of high interest rates. If there is a sustained period of high interest rates, that is not going to be good for anybody.
Which we've seen.
Yeah, which we've seen.
We've seen in the last...
We saw a period of practically zero interest rate during COVID. But
after that...
after that we've been there has been inflation, there has been... And that actually is a problem. So as long as, unless this problem is dealt with, the US debt problem is dealt with, there are going to be implications for everybody. We can't sit in India and think that अरे ये तो US का problem है,
हमारा नहीं है.
ये हमारा नहीं है.
ये वही वाली बात है ना, if US sneezes the whole world catches the cold, हम सुनते हैं ना इस चीज के बारे में.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely true है.
And now you're seeing China. We heard China dumping US bonds, right? Japan trying to do the same. So this again creates a vicious cycle.
It's essentially a counterbalance in the sense China has been reducing its bond holdings. Japan actually has slightly taken them up in the past few years, and today I think Japan is the largest holder of US Treasury. But like I said, I mean, the fact of the matter remains that the balance of power, if you keep printing more money and if you keep borrowing, generally the status of the US dollar as a reserve currency will end up getting challenged. Sometime and it's not going to happen overnight. It is a very, very slow, gradual process. But if you just keep printing money beyond a point of time, classic economics 101, the law of marginal diminishing utility comes in, and the value of the dollar will start diminishing. And that again becomes a problem for the United States as well as for the global trade order, world order, like we call it.
But मैं एक चीज सोच रहा हूँ, we've been hearing the so-called collapse of the US dollar. Means I've been hearing it since पता नहीं कब से. Then we had Bitcoin coming in, and then everyone started saying now the US dollar will not sustain. But it doesn't seem कि US dollar is going anywhere. I mean, at least for a person like me, I cannot see a world without a US dollar. What's your view on this? I mean, do you think there could be ever a place where US dollar could get challenged, and then by whom?
So I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes.
So that long.
So it basically, when there is change in the world order, right? Change in the world order typically takes centuries. It doesn't even happen. It doesn't happen in decades or years. It happens over 200, 300, 400 years. So the Roman Empire never collapsed overnight.
Correct.
It is a slow, it's a grind. And that's what probably will happen with the US as well, right? I mean, I don't expect that there will ever be a overnight collapse. That's not going to happen. It's more going to be of a slow and steady diversification from the US dollar away by people who are participating or trading in it, and that's how it loses its
Significance
status
or whatever.
or privilege. See, today the US dollar has the privilege of being the reserve currency of the world, and it's not going to go away overnight, like I said, and it might not even happen in our lifetime.
Correct.
It may happen over the next 100, 200 years, but this is an eventuality that could happen at some point of time, and this happens. If you look at the past 2,000-year history, it takes centuries, but world orders keep getting changed.
But like you said, of the high debt, like nearly 1.5 times is your nearly US debt to their GDP, right? If a day comes where we have the so-called debt collapse, or the debt creates an event, what will happen? Is it like a 2008 event we see, or do you foresee? Because हम लोग क्या देख रहे हैं, let's say you said 9/11, and you were saying at that time we were 50% of the US GDP. So let's say उस समय economy अगर 15 trillion की होगी तो 7-8 trillion का debt होगा. That 7 trillion in the last 20 years has become 40 trillion, right? So it's a huge growth. I mean, if your stock grows that guy, you'll be happy in so many years, right? What happens? There has to be some point or some tipping point where either the service of debt becomes impossible. What happens during that event? Because even it's not just US, right? If we see the world debt chart, I saw it some time back. It's a huge chart. I mean, I was reading कितना था मुझे याद नहीं, but the debt of the world is very high if we combine all countries. What do we do? What happens?
So I think,
or is there a tipping point or not?
See, there's an important distinction to be made between the global financial crisis and any other debt crisis in the world. See, the global financial crisis essentially was a financial system corporate crisis, in the sense that there were companies that were that blew up their balance sheets. Now, a unique thing about countries and economies is that countries and economies are perpetual in nature. They don't have an end of life. So humans, corporations, they will get tenured debt. Okay.
आपका 10 साल का डेट है,
10 साल का है, 15 साल का है, 30 साल का है. But in theory, a country can have perpetual debt because it's going to perpetually exist. ये कभी मरने नहीं वाली, तो मुझे वो रिस्क नहीं है कि भाई ये मर गई तो मेरे पैसे क्या आएंगे. This is going to be in existence for perpetuity.
Forever, in a way.
So that's a very important nuance to understand, and therefore, the only thing that a country really needs to do is maintain its credibility. Because if you maintain your credibility, your debt can always get refinanced. The only problem arises if your debt is not refinanced, which is if you end up doing something really silly and stupid and you lose credibility, and then people say, no, we don't want to refinance your debt. But otherwise, technically, country debt can keep going on and on forever. So if at all, the biggest risk for or loss of credibility is let's say someday some country which has an obscene amount of debt to GDP or debt comes and says we're going to devalue our currency, and that would be a loss of credibility event, and that could have ramifications for the whole world. And then we could see huge outflows of capital from every market, every kind of asset class, because then people will start wondering that, oh, if a country cannot be trusted,
तो हम का ही
Wow.
but US के जिस दिन ऐसा हो गया तो मतलब then we are looking at obviously a doomsday. I mean,
Exactly.
you know, so
So-
that's something which is not expectable, right?
not, I mean, like I said, I mean, I would hope to not see
Not
it in
see
our
it,
lifetime.
correct.
But these are possibilities that can play out at some point in
So
time.
debt will, let's assume, keep growing, and still the economy is growing and things are functioning as it is, right?
As long as as long as you're able to manage it
Manage.
in a certain and you are able to maintain your credibility to keep refinancing it, keep repaying it over a period of time, I think it should not be too much of a problem.
Let's talk once about Japan, right? You know, we had a time in 80s, late 70s, 80s. Japan was like roaring to growth, unstoppable. They were actually acquiring everything left, right, and center. And then we had the decades, what do you call the lost decades of Japan where nothing happened. Why did it happen? And I also want to understand, can we land in a country like India, a stage similar to Japan, where we lose decades worth of growth? Is it a possibility? Or is it Japan did something really, I don't know, stupid or whatever you want to call it?
So, to answer that, right, I mean, we got to understand what is growth. So over the long term, over the extreme long term, there is a very high correlation between GDP of a country and the total market cap of that country. So if as long as GDP keeps going up, market cap keeps going up, and and there is a very high correlation over the long term. In the shorter term, obviously, there are wild swings. Now, when you break down, the GDP essentially is a function of two things. One is the growth of the population. How many people actually at any given point of time are producing in your economy, are active in your workforce. And the second is productivity gains. How productive are the people working in your economy, and how much can they produce? Now, the first number, which is the population, is a long-term number. It takes ages
Decades.
for that number to improve gradually, etc. The second number gets built in by way of efficiencies. So if you bring in efficiencies, government policies, etc., the quantum of production that any human or any person in the workforce can do goes up to a point. Up to a point, you'll hit a ceiling, and then the productivity per person active in the workforce will plateau. What happened with Japan is that they did phenomenally well after the World War II. The productivity per active participant in the workforce kept going up, and till it peaked in the 1990s. And then after that, at some point of time, people stopped looking at the population equation. So if you see, both things have plateaued.
Correct.
There is no population. In fact, population growth has fallen off a cliff in Southeast Asian countries, as well as now is becoming a problem in European countries. So now if there are no people, where is the growth going to come from? And because you can only get productivity gains up to a certain point of time, right? So Japan's problem is the productivity capped out, the population growth fell below the replacement rate of 2.1, and now this has become a structural problem. For India too, if we fall below, so we will keep getting productivity gains. The government is doing a great job trying to bring in ease of doing business, GST, etc. All of these are attempts to increase the per capita GDP. So the quantum of production that every human can do. But we also are seeing a period of slowing population growth. If we end up facing into a situation where our growth of population and our rate of reproduction falls below the replacement rate, which is 2.1, we will see that some point of time growth will plateau and actually start falling off a cliff, and we could end up facing a situation like how Japan has. So it's not a problem for today, it's a problem for 30-40 years
Down the line.
And I think in this period, it's important. I think one thing that Japan confused and is asset inflation. So there was massive asset inflation in Japan because the Nikkei hit some 39,000-40,000 level in the early 1990s. People start assuming asset inflation as real production and wealth creation. I think, and once that bubble deflates, things come back down to these long-term trends of growth of GDP, growth of population, growth of productivity. So we should also not get confused by, oh, our market is doing very well, so we are doing very well.
So if you're saying asset inflation, I just two places came to my mind. Let's say any asset, right? So let's say aaj India ho ya UAE ho, where I would say you are reaching points of asset inflation. You think a bubble will burst, or people just assume कि या तो growth हो ही जा रही है, this will keep going up, and nothing will happen.
No, at some point of time, if the asset fails to live up to, when you buy an asset, you're buying either an asset for growth or you're buying an asset for cash flow. The asset has to live up to the promise of the valuation that is being set for it. So today, India is a growth market. People in India are paying high valuations because we expect that for the next 25 years, we will have a period of high growth. We will be one of the highest and the fastest growing economies in the world, at least till the 2040s and 2047. And if the risk of the bubble exploding or the valuation multiples getting derated is when we stop living up to this promise of high growth. God forbid if something were to happen where we would end up in a phase of low growth, then it would become a real problem. Then we could actually get derated from being a country which gets valued at 20, 22, 23 PE to a 10, 11, 12 kind of a PE number. So all asset bubbles can break if, like I say, if they don't honor the promise which is expected from them.
But historically we were to see, we tend to get these so-called different types of bubbles, whatever it may be 2000, maybe 2008, it may be whatever. Every, there's an economic cycle to it, 7 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, jo bhi ho, right? Is it because of the same reason that, the expectations go out of hand and then a bubble gets created and then?
Yeah, I mean, see, the way of creating a bubble is very clear, right? I mean, people start extrapolating near-term trends into perpetual trends.
जैसे आजकल valuations.
And then they end up and essentially FOMO drives prices up. And as prices keep going up and up, and I think more people come in wondering that they've missed out the bus. And then that's how actually bubbles get formed and euphoria gets created. And then at some point of time it bursts because people start realizing that, oh, I'm paying 10 rupees for something that is worth 1 rupee. And when bubbles do burst, they very quickly come back to the mean. So it's a law of mean reversion, and which will keep playing. It's like gravity. Mean reversion is like gravity. If a bubble has gone up too far ahead, it will come back.
So again, coming to stock market, let's say the new age companies which are getting listed right today, the new so-called startups which are valued at sometimes absurd valuations. Recently some companies I was just listening to interviews, and the valuations they were talking is that even if you do this growth for the next 10 years, tabhi bhi logic nahi ban raha, but you're still getting, and people are investing. And when I say people, they're institutional investors investing. So I'm just trying to understand how, now you run a mutual fund as well, right? How do you, as an institutional thinker, because the retail will follow the institution. If an institution is giving a confidence that I'm ready to, invest at absolutely, from a logical point of view, absurd valuation, right? Retail investors to fir jayega hi usme.
So there are 2-3 things. First, let's talk about the companies and the valuations. Again, like I said, these companies are offering a promise of extended periods of high growth and a certain set of optionality of future businesses, which is not currently baked in, and which is why there is hope in these companies, and therefore they are valued the way they are. So in a lot of cases, it's not a price to earnings multiple; it's a price to hope multiple. And see, the way to think about it is like these are great businesses, these are great assets, but they are not necessarily great investments. So to give you an example, right? Look at something similar played out during the dot-com bubble when prices of an Infosys or Wipro etc. went over the roof. The price of Wipro in the 2000-2001 cycle, the peak, okay, was actually reclaimed. After that, it fell. The bubble burst. The price of Wipro reclaimed its 2000 peak in 2022. It took 22 years for the price to go back above the peak of the dot-com bubble. So now what's important to understand is that today you may buy these companies as an investor. If you hold and forget, there is a possibility that after 20 years, many of them may not exist. Or the price that you bought today, they may go through such a long time correction that it would take ages for you to get your money back. Now, to answer your second question as to why are institutions doing it, is because institutions, like I said, believe that there is certain optionality in the business. There are certain pieces of the business that are not yet baked into the numbers. The numbers will come, the history will change. But we've got to understand that institutions are relatively smarter investors. They are actually tracking numbers, etc. They, like I said, they also are betting on hope for the story to play out in a certain manner. But institutional investors are ruthless. If they start believing that hope is evaporating and the bubble is fading and the company is not able to deliver on its promise, institutions will be ruthless in selling.
So they don't wait. I mean,
they are not going to wait for 20 years. But what ends up happening is that a retail investor who may have followed an institutional investor in buying will not even come to know that an institutional investor has sold. The retail investor will be left with the bag of stock in his.
That's a very common thing to happen, right?
Correct. So like I said earlier, I mean, you cannot, a retail investor, if he's making an investment that I'm going to invest in ABC stock based on अरे इसने ले लिया या उसने ले लिया, that is borrowed conviction. And borrowed conviction will not make you money for long
Goes back
periods.
to your first point when you said कि, but like you just said, and I'm just trying to think, एक time होता था जब हम बोलते थे कि stock low and forget it, right? And buy a stock, forget it for long term, it'll go and it'll give you massive returns over a period of time. Does that mean that time has changed, considering more also being in an advent of an AI world where things are changing at such a rapid pace that companies may only not survive today, the world we are in, companies may not survive 10 years. Like you've seen all the big companies, and these are common ki Kodak aayi, Kodak collapse ho gayi, Nokia aayi, Nokia khatam ho gayi, BlackBerry aayi, BlackBerry khatam ho gayi. But now it'll even happen faster because with the whole AI thing. So that means the investment philosophy also has to change.
So I think this buy and hold is massively abused. I think I think Buffett used to say this, that buy and hold. I think what people it is supposed to be a phrase: buy and hold and continuously review.
वो बोलते नहीं.
वो continuously review. It is got lost. If you see some of the greatest investors, even Mr. Buffett, there are certain investments that he's held for years, but there are certain investments that he's held for less than a year also, for less than 6 months also, for less than 2 years also. So in fact, early on in his career, there have been periods where he has churned his portfolio twice a year as well. Almost 50% of his portfolio has gone through churn. So ये buy and hold सुनने में अच्छा लगता है, but reality is, like I said, is buy and hold and continuously review. And the reason why you continuously review is that, see, no company goes bust overnight. There are always signs. There are always signs. No stock will go from 100 to 0 in one day. It will go from 100 to 90, 90 to 80, 80 to 70, 70 to 50. The market will give you hundreds of opportunities to review. and understand. So it is your job as an investor to figure out what caused the stock to go from 100 to 80. Let's say if the rest of the market also fell 20%, your stock also fell 20%, you can say, okay, this is pretty much in line with the rest of the market. Are there market specific factors, industry specific factors, or stock specific factors? You've got to keep your mind open and understand that if there is a stock specific factor problem, which is not linked to an industry specific problem and not linked to a market problem, there is a big red flag, which means that you have to review and exit. So investment doesn't mean you buy and forget. That's not what is supposed to, that's not what you're supposed to do. You just got to continuously keep reviewing, and like new businesses will transform. Businesses are going to see different shapes and forms. A company was, so let's take classic case of Reliance, right? I mean, Reliance for the longest period of time was an oil and gas company. Today, only half of the value of Reliance comes from oil and gas, so probably less than half of it. More than half of value comes from Reliance Retail, Reliance Jio. This is a transformation that has happened. So as an investor, you got to get an understanding as to, is my company actually going to truly survive or not? And if it is, then you stay invested. If it's not, then you find an exit and move out. And like I said, the market will give you many opportunities.
But tell me something, and we were talking about currency. India today is one of the fastest growing economies. Why is rupee falling to such an extent? I mean, what is the correlation, and why rupee today is 1991 to the dollar, right? What is that? Why so much?
Again, this is basic economics. This is a concept called interest rate parity. So long-term interest rates in the United States are 4%. Long-term interest rates in India are between 6.5%, let's say for argument's sake. So there is a 2.5% spread. Now, what does interest rate parity mean? Interest rate parity means that every year your currency needs to depreciate by the difference between your long-term interest rates. Otherwise, a free arbitrage will open up. What do I mean by that? So to give you an example, let's say I'm a US investor. And theoretically, if my borrowing cost is 4%, I can borrow $100 at 4%, convert them into, let's say for argument's sake, 90 rupees. Now deploy that $100 into 90 is 9,000 rupees. Add a 6.5-7% interest rate and make 7% on that 9,000. Correct. Okay, so which is roughly 630 rupees. And reconvert that back into dollar at 90, get $6 because, or say $7, and pay back my $4 interest, and I'm left with an interest-free gain of $3 by merely trading between A country and B country. Now, the only way this arbitrage goes away is if the rupee depreciates. Only if at the time of the end of 1 year, if instead of 90 for my interest, if I'm getting 92, then I have made no money, no arbitrage essentially. So if there is a spread, the arbitragers will come and eat away and narrow the spread till such time that the spread exists. So this concept of interest rate parity will always remain, and
it will always be there. So we will see dollar to 100, then we'll keep on seeing this is like a never.
So long as we see the difference between Indian interest rates and US interest rates, this will always remain.
But it हमेशा ही रहेगा. If we, at least in our lifetime, I've always seen. So I would say
developed economies.
Correct.
If India becomes a developed economy by, let's say, 2047, and our interest rates and inflation drops to, let's say, sub 1% sustainably, or 2% sustainably, and we also have a 4%, at that point, the interest rate parity goes away.
So yes, it's not 2047 is so far away. Yeah, so we'll see a dollar to 200 that time.
Yeah, and which is in the sense, the reason why India also has a higher interest rate is also because it's a growth economy. See, growth causes inflation. And so in a sense, it's all right if you're seeing a dollar depreciate, the rupee depreciate versus the dollar. It's because it's coming on the back of growth. The problem would be if you would have had no growth, but high inflation and high interest rates, and a depreciating rupee, that would be disastrous. But I think there is reasonable balance because we have good growth to offset.
That. And we've been talking about how, India is a high growing economy. And how do you see it moving forward? And do you see that we've already priced in a good growth, both from economic perspective and stock market perspective? Or you think we still have a long way to go in terms of not pricing in that growth?
No, we have a very long way to go. We have a very, very... You see, India is not prohibitively expensive. Today, the Nifty 50 trades at some 21, 22 multiple. The mid-cap indexes and the small-cap indexes trade at the higher 20s. So they're in the 27 to the 30 range kind of multiples. So it's not like we are trading at 50 times, 80 times, 100 times earnings and therefore we have priced away a lot of our future growth. No. I think it's a pendulum that keeps swinging from here to there. There is a period of slightly higher valuations. There's a period of slower valuations, median valuations. But generally, considering that we have a long runway, see, I think the biggest driver for Indian growth story is two things. Like, if like to go back to our previous conversation, both we are going to see an increasing number of people join the workforce. So the population entering the workforce to contribute to the
GDP.
Population part of the GDP equation is high. And we are going to continue to see productivity gains because the government keeps coming up with infrastructure, keeps deregulating, etc., etc. So the runway for us is fairly long, at least for the next 20-25 years. And hopefully by that point of time, like I said, we are able to solve this equation and maintain this equation. And we are able to have sustainable population growth so that production can keep going up. We are sorted. But I think, like I said, for the next 20-25 years, I wouldn't be worried.
So passive investing, I think so, is, being sold as right now a low cost, low stress, and safe. What's your view on that?
So passive investing is good. I think it's a good starting point for people who may want to begin their journey, understand their journey. It comes with, like you rightly said, low costs, simple rules. I think the reason why passive investing works is that because it's fairly simple in the sense that the rules are simple, it's disciplined, and there is no scope of deviation, etc., etc. So passive investing, like I said, is good. The excess of anything is bad. So if in the US now we are starting to see passive investing relies on a set of active investors to actually do the research and set the price. Because passive investing strategies are predominantly derived basis price movement. If everybody starts doing passive investing and there is nobody left to actually do active investing and set the price, then we would end up again in a bubble-like a territory because there would be tremendous mispricing that would happen. So I think there exists a space for passive as well as active investing. Passive investing is a great starting point, low-cost starting point, and should be a part of any investor's portfolio.
And again, talking more globe, we've been hearing a lot about AI and the valuations, absurd, what people say. Do you think from a valuation, and I'm not talking from a technological perspective, how AI may be good, more talking from a valuation perspective, do you think it's a bubble? Especially, I would say right now we're hearing more from a US perspective. Do you think it's a bubble?
So, there are two types or two parts of the AI market. One is these ultra large big seven in the S&P 500, which are the Google has its own LLM, Nvidia, which is essentially the GPUs, Microsoft, which is backing OpenAI, Meta has its own AI play. So that part doesn't seem like a bubble for 2-3 reasons. Because one, those businesses have very strong cash flows. Number one, they have not become prohibitively priced. Number two, Number three, they are actually reinvesting their operating cash flows into building this AI play. So it's not like none of them have done fundraising or issued equity in order to fund this AI growth. So I think for these few reasons, could the valuations be slightly cheaper? Yes, why not? But are they astronomical? The answer is no. This is good growth backed, cash flow backed valuations for these top players. The problem and the bubble is essentially in the early stage AI companies, where companies, you would have read that there are various companies which are 6 months old, 1 year old. They've got $10 billion valuations, $8 billion valuation, $3 billion valuation.
With zero cash flow,
With
zero
zero
money.
cash flow, zero visibility of
anything coming up.
Any earnings. So I was recently seeing a podcast by I don't want to name him, but this was one of the people who left OpenAI when the OpenAI coup was being attempted against Sam Altman. So he went up and he set up his own AI company and raised valuation at an extremely high number. It's in the few $1 billion. And then somebody asked him, what's your revenue stream and are you ever going to make money? And he said, we've not thought about it yet and we're going to think about it in the next few years. And so, things like those could end up getting into bubble territory, but not so much on the listed space. Are we in an era like .com bubble? Far from it.
That was actually my next question. That how do you then differentiate between a .com bubble, where again a new technology comes up, or the first time such technology comes up, and people start talking crazy stuff at that time, and then suddenly we go. Maybe a difference I would think would be at that time we wouldn't have these large 7 type companies with huge cash flows to sustain it. So is it similar to a .com bubble or very different?
No, it's different from the .com bubble, like I said, right? Because there is, if you look at the winners of the .com, the Amazons of the world, for the Googles of the world, Google did not even exist at the time of the .com bubble.
Correct, yeah. Amazon had started.
Same, even Facebook did not exist at the time of the .com bubble. So and the bubble was far, far larger at that point of time. It was not being funded entirely by internal accruals or cash flows. It was, again, the
borrowed capital or whatever.
It was capital equity issued at obnoxious prices. I don't think that's happening today, at least in the listed space. Like I said, the challenge is in the early stage.
New age companies or...
Correct.
And I was just reading somewhere that, Warren Buffett is sitting on a lot of cash and he's been selling. And I'm just trying to think and correlate to what we've been discussing on huge positive, what we see for the world, for India. But a very intelligent investor is trying to reduce his holdings. A couple of $200-300 billion of cash being held. Is it a time to be slightly cautious from a financial investments point of view? Especially, you talk a lot about investing more in equity, or especially for the younger lot. So what's your view on that? And why would Warren Buffett be fearful or of the markets, or, I don't know what you want to say, but...
So see, again, like I said, Warren Buffett's cash position is a reflection of his view. You can make inferences from it, but you should not be overly worried or make your decision based on that cash position that he has. See, he has a $380 billion cash pile, I think. Yeah, and the problem for him is that there is so much money
that he doesn't have good businesses to invest in.
Correct. And meaningful sized businesses.
You'll not invest $1 billion, right?
See, if you invest $1 billion, it's not going to move the needle.
Move the needle at all.
So for them, they need a ticket size of an 8-10 billion or a 20 billion for them to even have some meaningful position. And today, probably he doesn't find those opportunities enough to look or to deploy that capital. He's a smart, astute investor. He will deploy on a bad day when there is blood on the street and we won't even know. He's
deployed all that.
Yeah, and for him, again, he has to be more cautious about how he invests, because when you invest $20 billion or a $10 billion in a particular deal, you have to be that much more careful because you don't have an easy exit as well. See, for the beauty or advantage
that's such a big problem to have. I'm just trying to think now
Yeah.
that you're saying, first of all, you're very
you buy,
limited.
see, he has to trade elephants.
Correct.
You buy an elephant. If you buy an elephant, it's impossible to sell an elephant. So you got to think about it from every perspective. So he has to buy from the perspective of holding, because when he sells, there'll be no buyer.
Correct. और इतना तो sell करना nearly impossible होगा.
Correct.
Who will come and buy $20-30 billion of a stock?
Correct. So, and that problem retail investor does not have. See, today if you are investing a crore, 5 crore, I'm saying 100 crores also. You can get in and get out of a 100 crore position very quickly without having to worry कि भाई मुझे exit मिलेगा नहीं मिलेगा, मैं क्या करूँगा, मैं फंस जाऊँगा.
Too small to think on that.
ये सब चीज में कोई लेना देना ही नहीं है. So I think his reality is very different than our reality, and we don't, like I said, we should not make any inference from his $380 billion.
Because when they have now become successful is when people want to follow them, right? Maybe when at an earlier time no one cared. Now they're like, जो Warren Buffett stock खरीदे वही हम खरीदे तो. That's how the mindset of retail goes now. But yeah, like you said, his problems are way too.
His problems are very different.
Very different. But like you were saying, you would, for a youngster, you would definitely say be more in equity. But from an asset allocation point of view, what's your view on real estate or other financial assets?
So, in my view, see, I'm an all equities guy, and I think equities as an asset class offers advantages that other asset classes do not offer, which are, one, you can invest in equities even starting from a small ticket size. See, for real estate, the problem is, unless or until you now have a few crores lying here and there, you cannot invest in real estate. So size is a big advantage that equities offer. The second big advantage that equities offer versus real estate or any other asset for that matter is the power of reinvestment. See, today you may get a 2% dividend from a 100 rupee stock you own. You can reinvest that 2 rupees, and the power of reinvested earnings is so large that when you take a 20-30 year review, the compounding difference is massive. Now, you may have a 1 crore house, you may get a 3 lakh rupee rent, you can't buy a 3 lakh rupee property.
तो कुछ नहीं मिलेगा, correct.
So reinvestment again becomes a big problem. Liquidity. See, today you can sell, the world has to, all hell were to break loose, you want to sell, you'll get your money back tomorrow morning. Real estate is an illiquid asset, you're stuck with an asset. So, I think, and one big advantage again, which is the more underappreciated advantage of equities, is that you are essentially buying a piece of a company. The company is making profit. A company effectively is reinvesting its profits for further growth. So actually that's how compounding really plays out, and you get massive capital appreciation over the years. In real estate, that's not happening. There is no reinvestment, forget of dividends, but I'm saying reinvestment in the business itself for the value to be larger. There is no such thing. So with these items in mind, my preference has always been, you have equities as your core asset allocation when you're looking for wealth creation. If you want to maintain your wealth, you want to generate income, then obviously you look at debt as an asset class based on your own personal profile. And to some extent, if you want to have certain amount of gold, silver, certain commodities in general, to have an uncorrelated mix of assets, that's fine. But in my view, real estate is essentially for consumption, not for investments.
And now let's see the retail investor, right? In the age of, I would say, high-end algorithms, that's what I hear now. I would like to listen to you on this algorithm thing, or institutional speed or institutional research. How do retail investors fit in, right? Because let's understand, it's not for the good or bad. Let's understand, today more people in the market are for trading than investment. right? I mean, they want to trade. But in the age of all this algorithms coming up, and how do these retail investors survive then? Because it's very tough for, let's be practical, all retail investors may not want to invest. They may want to trade, and maybe trade in a stock. I'm not saying trade from an F&O perspective as well. How do they survive in this algorithm? And I keep on seeing these videos that someone makes an algorithm, or some people, there are companies who create great algorithms and they
Yeah.
trade on their own or something like
Yeah.
that.
So it's tough. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it, but if you are a retail investor, today in the market, when you are trading, you are competing with, these are called HFTs, high frequency trading firms, algorithmic trading firms.
And they're legal.
Quant firms. These are all legal. Essentially, they're using advanced technologies, machine learning, algorithms, etc., in order to trade in the markets. If I were to give you an analogy, you're going to a war. There are these institutional grade people who are going to a war with AK-47 and Iron Man grade suits and that kind of advanced weaponry. And a retail investor is essentially going with a knife. If you are trading without systems, without rules, you are essentially just gambling and speculating, and your odds of succeeding against an Iron Man grade weaponry with your knife is tough. So I think the retail investor has to understand, or a trader for that matter, has to understand what is his strength. The retail investor's strength lies in his ability to be patient. His strength lies in his ticket sizing. So size is a huge advantage in favor of a retail investor. See, an HFT is deploying, like it's similar to the Warren Buffett problem, right? You're
Huge
deploying
capital.
billions of dollars. You make, for a single trade, you'll have to make $100 million trade. You will move markets. So the impact cost is so high. For a retail investor, there is no impact cost. You can get in, get out practically at little to no impact cost. So retail investors usually do not have, they are answerable to themselves. A lot of these firms, institutions, etc., they operate through very bureaucratic mechanisms, right? They have committees and investment committees through which they have got to get these rules approved, algos approved, etc., etc. And there's a lot of oversight, risk management principles, and
it's not their money also,
yeah,
right?
it's not their money. Correct. It's not entirely their money.
It's not their entirely.
So I think the fact that a retail investor has his own money and he's accountable only to himself is such a huge superpower that they enjoy. So I think for a retail trader to truly succeed, he has to understand what part of the game that can I win. It's a David versus Goliath game. If I'm taking on Goliath, it's not that David cannot win. David can win, but he needs to understand what is the game that he needs to play and accordingly play that game and win. If he tries to play the same game that the Goliath is playing, he's going to get slaughtered.
So I've been seeing this a lot, the concept of fire, right? Online. Just explain us, what is this?
So,
because this has become like a,
yeah, so a lot of influencers, a lot of people have been
it's promoted very heavily online, by the way. So
they say financial independence for retirement early.
Correct.
It's something of that sort.
Retirement at 40, 35.
Yeah. So I think the way, and I think people are taking, first of all, there are a few people whom I have seen who tried to get onto this bandwagon of FIRE and said that, I'm going to make enough money by the time I'm 40 and then I'm going to retire. I quit my job and I will have enough of a retirement corpus. I will do trading, investing, etc. And that corpus will pay for it. I think there are multiple problems with this approach. First, you don't know how much you're going to live. So and I think, people generally build in life expectancy up to 80. But sometimes you may live up to 90. Some people may live up to 95 or you may have to provide for something else. So this whole retirement early concept is a very assumptions based concept, and assumptions are, like, the word assume itself has as you and me. so it's very risky in order to think that, I'm going to have a pot of money and then going to forget
Or
about
chill the whole life.
Yeah,
I'm going to, and the problem is people get so influenced by this because they will show there's so much of wealth displaying happening on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's very scary. पहले तो ये नहीं पता सच क्या है झूठ क्या है. The first trouble is that. But these people are getting so awe of that. कि आप तो 40 बोल रहे हो, मैं तो देख रहा हूँ people actually I've seen videos. We'll retire at 30. हालांकि 30 तो career start नहीं होता. People are talking about retirement at 30.
And the reality is, see, also what happens is you can't predict what's going to happen, right? See, 2008 happened. People who had put money in their 401ks for life
Gone.
had lost substantial part of equity.
Yeah.
Now, if let's say something like this were to happen, all hell were to break loose, and your corpus would half, what would you do? I mean, what would you do? I mean, so I think the way to think about this is aim for financial freedom, aim for financial independence, but don't link retirement to that. I think the biggest asset, and I think people underestimate, and especially young people, and I tell them the biggest asset that you have is yourself. See, your mutual fund portfolio or your stock portfolio is a few lakh rupees. If you're early 20s, the biggest asset that you have is your lifetime earnings. If you were to do a cash flow analysis of how much money you would make in your 40-year career, that amount would be far larger than any investment that you
100%,
hold today.
100%, yeah.
So people must actually find a way to work on themselves, appreciate the value that they can bring to the table, and build their earning power. And investments are essentially just a source of second income. And therefore, that in that extent, that's a contradiction to retirement early, right? I mean, because you don't retire early because you are your biggest asset. Your income itself is your biggest asset. So aim for financial freedom, aim for financial independence,
Don't link retirement to
but
it.
don't link retirement to it.
And should investment strategy also change with how stable or unstable my career is? I mean, do you evolve with that, or you keep a strategy? No, irrespective how my career may move over my lifetime, let's say, because it may not always be stable, I keep my investment strategy going the same way.
No, 100%. I think how stable your job should have a huge influence on what your asset allocation is, how much risk you take. So if you think you have you're in a super stable job, you're going to keep getting your annual appraisals, your annual bonuses with substantial certainty, then you can take more risk. So in the equation of risk assessment, right, we always understand we have one nuance of ability to take risk. See, there is one concept of willingness to take risk, and then there is a concept of ability to take risk. Again, both are independent.
Very different.
I can have very high willingness to take
Correct.
risk. I can be like, अरे यार मैं तो कुछ भी ले सकता हूँ. But मेरी औकात क्या
है कि नहीं है?
What is my ability to take risk? That ability depends on your stability. So if you have a stable job, your ability is high. But if you are in a job which is likely to, you might lose your job, it's a cyclical industry, etc., then you have a problem really, and your therefore ability to take risk is low, and that should have an influence on your asset allocation.
Okay, I have a few rapid fire questions for you. Gold or Bitcoin next decade? I know I've heard you speaking against Bitcoin. I don't know why you are against Bitcoin. Maybe you can let us know on that also. But so answer maybe gold. But what do you think on the next decade? Taking the emotion out of Bitcoin.
So I mean, because this is rapid fire, 95-5.
Okay, 95-5. Okay.
95 in favor of gold and 5 in just merely as a speculative bet.
As a speculative bet. Okay. Biggest investment mistake you have ever made?
Thinking and trusting that a previously tainted promoter and a promoter who has had failed execution in the past will somehow suddenly turn around and be a changed man or woman, and therefore create wealth. I think that was a big mistake that I've made. And I think I've learned that people usually rarely cannot change
So fast.
change so fast, and therefore backing the right horses in that, the jockeys in the right sense, which are the right managements from making money, are important.
Your best ever investment. Name.
Many, but I think recently one of my best investments was NSC.
But that's still unlisted.
Yeah, it's still unlisted, but it's fairly liquid, trades like a liquid stock.
One investing book everyone should read, and don't name me a Buffett book or something, just apart from the known, I would say, books which people should read.
So I think two books. One, if you are trader mindset oriented, there is a book called is by Nicholas Darvas. I forgot it's How I Made My First 2 Million in the Stock Markets, or How to Make 2 Million in Stock Markets. It's something of that sort. Exact name I can't remember. It's by a very famous trader called Nicholas Darvas. I think this is a book that every trader must read. And if you have an investor bent of mind, then Common Stocks, Uncommon Profits, I think by Philip Fisher. That is a book that you should look at.
Most overrated investor in the world.
I don't want to take a name, but anybody who's promising you
Great returns.
guaranteed returns,
Guaranteed returns.
fixed returns.
People need to be careful about this,
Yeah.
right? We always end up seeing some Ponzi scheme coming up or something weird coming up, and people get drawn to that lalach, I would say.
Fixed, guaranteed, milega hi milega. These are all
banned words.
banned, overrated
Overrated.
scams.
Most underrated economy as per you.
I think Vietnam. I think Vietnam looks like an underrated economy.
AI, more wealth creating or jobs destruction?
More wealth creation, definitely.
One piece of advice you would like to give youngsters today.
Learn the concept of compounding early on, preferably when you're in your early 10s.
That early?
Yeah, and find a way to enjoy the benefits of compounding from as early as possible. I think that is one advice I would give to anybody who's young, because you actually have the time that can allow compounding to create magic.
What if someone wants to do, or someone has not understood the compounding concept early on, and let's say they're in their 40s? Now we know compounding hits later on. How should they think about it then?
At least think about compounding for your kids. you know, I mean, in compounding, time is an important equation, part of the equation. So there's nothing that you can do to change that part of the equation. But like I said earlier, the better. If you did not enjoy the benefits of compounding, make sure that your kids who may be 10, 12, 14, they understand and they at least enjoy the benefits of compounding.
If Samco didn't exist, where would you put your money?
All in all, equities, yeah. So
one uncomfortable truth about Indian markets that people don't want to hear.
the return in the Indian markets over the next 20 years is going to be lower than the return in the Indian markets in the past 20 years.
So one last question similar to, you just mentioned, if markets were to disappoint in the next decade or so, what would be the reason? Would it be the risk in the system, a systematic risk? Or is it that, the euphoria or the concept of thinking कि market सिर्फ ऊपर ही जाती है?
So disappointment of markets will always come because of excessive valuations. And so, I mean, you get disappointed because your entry price is wrong. Nobody gets disappointed by putting money at the bottom. Everybody gets disappointed by putting money at the top. Because that's when you lose the maximum amount of money, or you have the maximum period of no return or painful period or drawdown.
मैं तो विप्रो का एग्जांपल सोच रहा हूँ. आपने जो बोला जो 2000 था, it took 22 years to go. But let's understand more from a practical aspect. Generally, people get drawn by this euphoria only. So most of the people would enter at the euphoric level before, and that's the reason why people lose money.
Yeah. So, I have a interesting analogy for this. So I often say that, when you go to a party, a great party, let's say, will start at 8, 9 p.m. there's a great bar going, cocktails are flowing. If you enter the party at 8, you'll have good fun. 9, you'll have good fun. 10, you'll have good fun. 11 also, you'll have fun. 12 also, you might have just a little bit more of fun because, by that time, people are getting exhausted, etc. DJs played for 3-4 hours. But if you enter the party at 1:30, okay, and you're probably one of the last set of people, you will only see people vomiting around you. तो आप सबसे ज़्यादा पार्टी में लेट घुसोगे तो आपको पार्टी का मज़ा नहीं आएगा, आपको सिर्फ उल्टियाँ देखने मिलेगी. सेम थिंग इज एप्लीकेबल इन द स्टॉक मार्केट ऑल्सो. इफ यू आर टू लेट टू द पार्टी, which basically means you entered at the last time, the level of disappointment that you're exposing yourself to is the highest.
But who knows it's the last level? The question is that.
No, so you will know. I think there are enough and more signs that as an individual, see, while it's impossible to catch an exact top, you'll not be able to find a period of top, but the behavior in every euphoria is the same. You will see a flurry of IPOs in a very short period of time. Excessively large IPOs at stupid valuations in a short period of time. You will see every Tom, Dick and Harry, your pan wala, thele wala, cab guy, your doodh wala, everybody asking you for a stock tip. Okay. You will find somebody who has not spoken to you for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, meet you at a party and ask you kaun sa stock liya. You will hear people bragging about, oh, I bought this A particular stock at X price. It has become 4x, 5x in the past 2 years. There are signs everywhere.
But you're talking about the current scenario, right?
Yeah.
आज की डेट में what I'm trying to match is that's what happening is current.
I mean, it's not as bad because for 2 years now people have not seen any money. In the sense, for 2 years people have seen a period of sideways return. So it's probably not that as bad. But I mean, like, you will see, like I said, there are enough and more signs which are available, and you'll know. See, when you'll know, there are various quantitative ways to find out, but we look at a number of things such as what's the median drawdown from 52-week highs, how many stocks are trading at certain levels, etc. So there are a lot of statistical ways where you can find out where we are in the market. And like I said, you'll never get the exact top, but you'll get a zone कि भाई 1 बज गया है, 12:30 बज गए या 1:30 बज गए. हाँ, तो फिर आप पीना बंद कर दो, आप जाना है तो आप निकल जाओ. So you have to control your urge. It's hard, but I think that is the art, that is the learning that retail investors need to develop to control their greed when everybody is greedy. When everybody think मैंने कल पैसा डाला मेरा डबल हो गया, तो वो greed को आप समझो और आप उससे बचो. I think when you start feeling envy in the market, so that's when very often markets create tops.
Sumit, thank you so much for this interesting conversation. Thank you for coming.
No, thank you so much.
Thanks.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.